Presidential spokesman Ronald Ziegler says Cox was fired for refusing to comply with President Nixon's order to halt court proceedings to obtain the Watergate tapes. Richardson said he felt obliged to resign because he owed an obligation to the Senate in the Watergate investigation. And the White House also says Assistant Attorney General William Ruckelshaus was fired for refusing a presidential order to fire Cox. We'll have more on these stories on the 10 o'clock news tonight. For WERS News, I'm News Director Alan Dorfman.
Nixon has accepted Attorney General Elliot Richardson's resignation and has fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus. The President also abolished the office of Special Prosecutor as of 40 minutes ago. This has been a special report from ABC Radio News in New York.
Group W News, Washington. In New York, the president of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York says President Nixon is creating a constitutional crisis by his White House tapes plan. An Orville Shell says Mr. Nixon is attempting to become Supreme Judge of the nation. Says Shell, it is obviously time for all citizens, and particularly members of the bar, to stand up and be counted if they believe in the principles of separation of powers. The head of the 102-year-old lawyers organization says the special Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox had been taking the only proper course in fighting the president's decision. And Senator Night Massacre earlier today had agreed. He said that Cox had a good case in objecting to Mr. Nixon's move to halt his pursuit of presidential tapes and papers. Mansfield, while agreeing with the White House compromise in relation to the Watergate Committee, made it clear he does not support it in relation to Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who has been fired tonight, and whose area of responsibility, Mansfield says, goes beyond that of the Senate's, including the ITT case and the Mitchell-Stans-Vesco case. A member of the Senate Watergate panel, Connecticut Senator Lowell Weicker, is also in opposition to the president's actions.
It is known that the Senate and the American people relied on the president's assurances and the appointment of Archibald Cox in confirming Elliot Richardson. It is now clear that the president's actions last night create new definitions for, quote, absolute authority, end of quote, and, quote, all decisions, end of quote.
Weicker made that statement before the firings and resignations tonight. He said that the compromise offer on the tapes was a deal between an evasive president and an easily diverted Congress. For some public reaction to the Nixon decisions, WINS newsman Stan Brooks talked to people on Fifth Avenue.
I think he already agreed to give them to Senator John Stennis, right? Let him review them, and then give them to him take the information to the committee and determine from there, you know, what was valuable in those tapes and what was not.
You think that's sufficient?
Yeah.
I think that since he appointed Mr. Cox, he should give Mr. Cox the opportunity to exercise his job. And if Mr. Cox feels he needs the tapes, I think he should be given the tapes.
The court system is a tremendous system here in our free world, you know, and I think he's wrong not to sort of uphold this.
I don't think that the president handled it as I would like it. But at the same time, I think that Mr. Cox should be held in insubordination because, after all, it is our president. And Mr. Cox hasn't got that type. I think he's too haughty for himself. And I believe that he should be dismissed.
And, of course, that's exactly what happened this evening. President Nixon has fired Archibald Cox, abolishing his post of special prosecutor. Elliot Richardson, the man who appointed Cox, the Attorney General of the United States, has resigned. The Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, who the president had ordered to fire Cox in the wake of Richardson's resignation, refused to do so, and he too was fired. And so the president did fire Cox himself. And now Robert Bork is the acting Attorney General of the United States. All this, the result of the Watergate White House tape recording controversy. According to the White House aides, that controversial tape recording, or group of them, are located in the executive mansion there at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but their precise location and the manner in which they are guarded remains just as classified as their content. The custodian was the Secret Service, but no one is saying now who is guarding the tapes. Mr. Nixon has said that he has taken personal custody of those tape recordings. WINS News Time is 8:47. Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox, Attorney General Elliot Richardson, has resigned, and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus has also been fired. Presidential spokesman Ronald Ziegler says Cox was fired for refusing to comply with President Nixon's order to halt court proceedings to obtain the Watergate tapes. Richardson said that he felt obliged to resign because he owed an obligation to the Senate in the Watergate investigation. The White House also says Ruckelshaus was fired for refusing the presidential order to fire Cox. Stay tuned to 1010 for all that's late in the controversy over the White House tape recording.
This is a CBS News special report. Departures from the Justice Department, the latest chapter in Watergate. I'm Neil Strasser, CBS News, reporting on the CBS Radio Network. Tonight, still another extraordinary chapter in the extraordinary and continuing story of Watergate. President Nixon has fired Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus. And the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, has resigned. All in the dispute over Mr. Nixon's order to Cox to cease all court actions aimed at obtaining those tapes of presidential conversations. It was a story which began last night when the president, seeking to avoid, he said, constitutional confrontation, decided not to appeal court orders to turn over the tapes, and instead said he would make summaries available. He thus ordered Cox, as an employee, he said, of the executive branch, to cease court actions in the case. But that ran afoul of the written guidelines exacted for Cox during Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on the nomination of Richardson to be Attorney General. In writing, Richardson had promised to give Cox full authority as the Watergate Special Prosecutor, and orally pledged he would not interfere with Cox's decisions. Even last night, Cox was quick to remind President Nixon of those promises.
The instructions are made in violation of the promises which the Attorney General made to the Senate when his nomination was confirmed. For me to comply with the instructions would violate my solemn pledge to the Senate and the country to invoke judicial process to challenge exaggerated claims of executive privilege. I shall not violate my promise.
And this afternoon, in a nationally broadcast news conference, Cox said the summaries of the conversations would not be admissible in court, and he promised to continue acting under his guidelines to go back to the courts to tell them what he sees as a non-compliance by the president with court orders.
One form of procedure would be to seek an order to show cause why the respondent should not be adjudicated guilty of contempt. I think it may also be possible, and perhaps might be preferable, to seek a further order clarifying any possible doubt resulting from the president's statement last night.
That occurred at 1 o'clock Washington time. By late afternoon, President Nixon was ordering the discharge of Cox. But then occurred the extraordinary series of events, all reported shortly before 8:30 tonight by White House News Secretary Ronald Ziegler. The president had called in Richardson. Richardson said he could not fire Cox because of his obligation to the Senate and resigned. Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus then was told to fire Cox. He refused. And Ruckelshaus, in the words of Ziegler, like Mr. Cox, has been discharged. Finally, it was the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, now named Acting Attorney General, who delivered the orders to Cox and who was also charged with transferring the Special Prosecutor's office back into the regular Justice Department framework. The office of Special Prosecutor, said Ziegler, has been abolished. This despite the distrust evidenced 5 months ago by the Senate of the government, in effect investigating itself in the Watergate affair. Until the events of tonight, the man standing ready to check the accuracy of those summaries of the taped conversations at President Nixon's request was the veteran senator from Mississippi, Democrat John Stennis. Tonight, Stennis one of the first to speak out on the resignation of the Attorney General.
Well, I regret very much the resignation of Secretary Richardson, whom I'd learned to respect very much. I was surprised, too, at this resignation, and it came unexpected to me.
For a time, it appeared the appointment of Stennis had driven a wedge between Cox and the Senate Watergate Committee. Stennis was acceptable, very much so, to Chairman Ervin and to Vice Chairman Howard Baker, and Ervin understood he would get verbatim transcripts of selected portions of those conversations rather than just summaries. He felt that would serve the committee's purposes, if not Cox's. But tonight, Ervin is now talking of the Congress going to its own special prosecutor.
Congress undoubtedly has power under the Constitution to establish a special congressional investigating committee. That's been held by the Supreme Court many times. And
And Congress has the power to describe who is going to prosecute a case, just as it did in the Teapot Dome case, where they took it out of the hands of the Justice Department and put it in the hands of an independent prosecutor by a statute. But of course, Congress, or any statute that Congress passes, is subject to a veto. I would favor the passage of a statute that would establish an independent prosecutor in these particular cases, just as was done in the Teapot Dome case.
Reaction to the discharge of Cox from another member of the Watergate Committee, Democrat Daniel Inouye of Hawaii.
I'm certain the Congress will not just sit by and treat this as business as usual, because the appointment of Mr. Cox was not the ordinary appointment. It came about after consultation with the members of the Congress of the United States. And so I'm certain that most of the members of Congress will feel that they should have been involved in the firing process of any.
The sudden changes at the Justice Department bringing comment also from Democrat Alan Cranston, the senator from California.
I'm shocked and startled, as I'm sure every American is, by the events that have unfolded in Washington today. The resignation of Mr. Richardson and Mr. Cox and Ruckelshaus are being fired seems to me to mean that three of the very best men in the Nixon administration have been ousted from it because they put loyalty to the law of our land above loyalty to Richard Nixon, unlike Mr. Ehrlichman and Mr. Haldeman and others who were involved in the Watergate affair.
Senator Edward Kennedy, the Democrat of Massachusetts, is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which will be called upon to approve the next Attorney General. Kennedy tonight called Cox's firing a reckless act of desperation by a president who was afraid of the Supreme Court, who has, said Kennedy, no respect for law and no regard for men of conscience. The burden, he said, is now on Congress to nullify this historic insult to the rule of law and to the nation's system of justice. Even before the firing of Cox, Kennedy had joined three other Democratic members of that Senate Judiciary Committee in charging that the instructions to Cox had violated an agreement on the role of special prosecutor. Senator Philip Hart of Michigan, Birch Bayh of Indiana, John Tunney of California, and Kennedy had issued the joint statement asking Richardson for an explanation. Of course, tonight, Richardson has now resigned with the instructions given to him to fire Cox. There's the further question. What effect will this shake-up in the Justice Department and the dispute over the Watergate tapes, what effect will it have on the congressional confirmation proceedings of the new Vice President-designate, Gerald Ford? That's a question that the Republican Senator Percy of Illinois addressed himself to.
There isn't any question but what the Congress has a constitutional responsibility. The first constitutional responsibility we have now is the confirmation proceedings of Gerald Ford. And I would anticipate that the proceedings now will take an entirely different tone and character. I think the President, by this action, has severely has placed in jeopardy the expeditious handling of the confirmation proceedings for Gerald Ford.
Ford earlier had spoken out in support of the compromise, the summaries of the taped conversations offered last night by President Nixon. There really has been little time for reflection on the fast events of this Saturday, but we have called in two of our correspondents, Daniel Shore, who has covered the Watergate story from the Senate viewpoint, and Fred Graham, who has covered it from the Justice Department viewpoint, and asked Daniel Shore and Fred Graham for their reflections.
Fred, there is an irony here. Only today, Cox noted that President Jackson had to appoint 3 secretaries of the Treasury in order to get one act accomplished, and now it seems there have had to be 3 attorney generals before they could get Cox fired. And I guess the first question is it legal? I guess it is legal. The man is acting attorney general.
Well, it's legal, but it's certainly unprecedented. Robert Bork woke up this morning as Solicitor General of the United States, and a rather green one at that. He started last June. And suddenly, tonight, he finds himself as acting Attorney General of the United States. But I would say in some difficulty right at the start, Dan.
Well, the difficulty seems clear. We've talked to as many senators as we can reach, and Senator Baker says amazing, surprising, is going to precipitate further debate in Congress. And, of course, every senator you talk to at this hour reacts about the same way. I suppose the question they will have to face is there'll have to be a new Attorney General appointed, and what's going to happen to that Attorney General when he comes up before the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Well, who is he going to be? Who will accept an appointment as Attorney General at this point when the Attorney General has been sacked in one day? His replacement, by law, the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, was sacked because he apparently wouldn't fire Cox, and then Robert Bork did. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of this country, and the implication will be for the new nominee that he too will have to go along with the fact that the special prosecutor, if there is a new one, will be under the thumb of the administration.
Ronald Ziegler, speaking for the president, has said that while the Watergate task force, which Cox headed, has now been abolished, and as you know, the FBI has now sealed it off, including all its records, still Ziegler says, quote, the Watergate prosecution will continue vigorously, unquote. Do you think that under these circumstances there can be a vigorous continuation of that prosecution?
Well, of course, you'll have to have an Attorney General first, and the question of his credibility in these circumstances is going to be highly suspect. It seems to me that you have to go back, Dan, to the basis of what we're discussing here. The president said in the first instance that he would not release the Watergate tapes because of a principle of confidentiality, that if he did, people would be leery of speaking frankly to the president. Now, that's important, but I do believe that at this point, reasonable people are going to wonder if that's the real reason why the president has sacked 2 attorneys general in one day and precipitated the kind of crisis we have tonight, or if perhaps maybe those who say that those tapes may show something that the president doesn't want to come to light, maybe that could be the reason, and I think that is what the new Attorney General is going to have to deal with.
We are now without a vice president. There is every sign that the deliberate speed that was going to be applied to the confirmation of Gerald Ford as vice president will become more deliberate yet. There's going to be difficulty, as you suggested, finding a new Attorney General, and if he's found, getting him confirmed, and one wonders whether the government can limp along in this depleted fashion.
Well, sure, and it seems to me that right now the Senate, with its Democratic majority, and they must be up in arms, has the upper hand. You cannot enforce the laws very long with an acting Attorney General who was suddenly raised from nowhere in the course of a sunny Saturday in Washington, and at some point they're going to have to bring the whole situation back into the framework of our Constitution.
Quite a Saturday. For Fred Graham, this is Daniel Shore, CBS News, Washington.
Quite a Saturday, too, for Elliot Richardson, who has been regarded as President Nixon's chief fireman, as it were. You'll recall he went very rapidly from Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare to the Defense Department as secretary there very briefly, then was put in the Justice Department job as the Watergate tidal wave was beginning to break, and as Attorney General Richard Kleindienst felt it necessary to resign because he would be prosecuting some friends of his. And now Richardson is out, resigned rather than carry out orders to fire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, Richardson saying he had to honor his promises made to the United States Senate. Attorney General, but the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, who you recall, also served as a temporary chief of the FBI. Ruckelshaus refused to fire Cox, and he was discharged by President Nixon. This has been a CBS News special report. Departures from the Justice Department, the latest chapter in Watergate.
Nixon fires special Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox in a bitter dispute over the White House tapes. Attorney General Elliot Richardson resigns his post in protest. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrives in Moscow for a hurriedly called meeting with Soviet leaders on the Mideast War. And with the war in its 3rd week, Israel and Egypt clash in the Sinai, and Israel penetrates deeper into Egypt. I'll have details on these and other stories in just a moment. When the president dramatically fired Cox, Attorney General Elliot Richardson resigned in protest. The president's action came just hours after Cox said he would seek to have Mr. Nixon held in contempt of court for refusing to hand over the tapes and other Watergate-related documents. We have a series of reports on the day's developments, beginning with ABC White House correspondent Jerry Landay.
In 4 swift strokes, a besieged president tonight took one of the most explosive actions in his and the country's history. He fired Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox because of Cox's refusal to obey presidential instructions. He abolished, at a stroke, Cox's 80-man Watergate Special Investigations and Prosecution Unit, transferring its functions to the Justice Department. Cox's office literally ceased to exist as of 8 p.m. Eastern Time. At a 30-minute meeting in the Oval Office late this afternoon, the President ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused because he'd promised the Senate as a condition of his confirmation that he would give Cox full independence to pursue Watergate as Cox saw fit. Richardson has now resigned. In a letter, he said the President had left him no alternative. Upon Richardson's refusal to fire Cox, the President turned to another prominent young member of the Nixon team, William Ruckelshaus. The President asked Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused and was himself promptly fired by the President. The Watergate drama has taken a half year to unfold. The President's unique actions in firing 2 popular and respected members of the executive branch and forcing a third to quit took less than 8 hours. The impact of all this, clearly colossal and yet to be measured. Jerry Landay, ABC News, the White House.
This is David Shoemaker. From the moment he sat down before reporters, it was clear Archibald Cox was going to press his case, just as it was clear that the President was determined to stop him.
I think it is my duty as the special prosecutor, as an officer of the court, and as the representative of the grand jury, to bring to the court's attention what seems to me to be non-compliance with the court's order. One form of procedure would be to seek an order to show cause why the respondent should not be adjudicated guilty of contempt.
Cox then went home to wait for the inevitable. But even before he heard the television bulletin, FBI agents acting on orders from the White House moved into the special prosecutor's office. 5 months of careful legal preparation to prosecute former top members of the Nixon administration, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and the rest, all that evidence now firmly under the control of the President himself. As for what happens next, without a special prosecutor, Judge John Sirica could proceed with a contempt citation because the President has refused the tapes. The special Watergate grand juries have lives of their own, and there is precedent for grand juries hiring private lawyers. And finally, the possibility of impeachment. What Archibald Cox was referring to a few moments ago when he said, and these are his words, "Whether ours shall be a government of laws and not of men," is now for Congress and ultimately the American people to decide. David Shoemaker, ABC News, Washington.
This is Sam Donaldson. When Elliot Richardson came to work this morning, he knew what the day might produce, for he had told Cox he would back him. Although the White House had advertised the tape compromise as Richardson's proposal, the truth was it differed significantly from Richardson's proposal. This afternoon, a department spokesman reported that Richardson had not approved the compromise, did not agree with it, and felt his promise made to the Senate not to interfere with Cox was being violated. When Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus left at dusk, he all but confirmed the news.
Well, there'll be an announcement out of the White House later on. I can't say it.
There will be?
Does it have to do with the resignation of the Attorney General? Well, it might.
The man left behind, Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, fired Cox when his superiors wouldn't and is now acting Attorney General. He's a former Yale law professor, a political conservative. Richardson had promised the Senate Cox would be truly independent. He felt the President's action undercut him, so he left tonight without a job, but feeling he had kept his word.
This is Stephen Geer. Senator Howard Baker watched the Cox news conference at his home in Tennessee, and when it was over, he was still convinced the tape compromise was a good one, at least for the Senate Watergate Committee. Tonight, Baker told us he doesn't believe the President should have fired Cox, but this afternoon he apparently didn't expect the firing.
Cox does have problems, and I'm sure he'll contend with them. He's an articulate, and he's a scholarly, and he's a very effective lawyer. But he's going to have to take care of that, and he has a different set of problems than we do. I'm convinced we'll do all right. And I have a similar belief that Cox will find a way to assert his contention that this arrangement does not comply with Judge Sirica's order. But I've got my hands full. Cox is going to have to do that on his own. That doesn't mean I'm not concerned about it, but it means I'm not going to try his lawsuits for him.
And in Asheville, North Carolina, Senator Sam Ervin seemed equally unconcerned about Cox's inability to obtain the actual tapes.
Senator Ervin, I'm sure you're familiar with Mr. Cox's objections to the compromise. I gather
Mr. Cox ought to have no objection to compromise because the compromise has no relation whatever to him.
Well, it does because the president has ordered him to take no further action.
I know, but that's got nothing to do with the committee's agreement.
No, I understand that. That's what Senator Baker said. But Senator Baker agreed that Mr. Cox has a problem.
Well, Mr. Cox does have problems. We've had problems. But Mr. Cox's problems and our problems are as far separate as the gulf was shown between Lazarus and Abraham's bosom and diabetes in hell.
Tonight, however, Senator Ervin called the firing of Cox a great tragedy, a great mistake. The events of tonight are just beginning to produce reaction, and some members of Congress have begun to demand impeachment. Stephen Gear, ABC News.